Hello everybody and welcome. I hope you saw our little messages we were sending through to you to say we had some minor technical difficulties before we could kick off today, but we are now able to make a start. Welcome, thank you for logging in to this Foundation Years webinar on the Reception Baseline Assessment. My name is Ellie Sugate-Francis. I'm from the Early Childhood Unit at the National Children's Bureau. We are so excited about the webinar today. We have the Standards and Testing Agency and NFER here to tell you about baseline assessment, what you need to know. Just to give you a brief overview of what's going to be happening today. So today we are going to be a very brief introduction to the Foundation Years programme, and we'll tell you a bit about the Foundation Years programme. We're then going to move very quickly to the presentation itself. I just want to tell you a little bit about questions and what's happened about that. We asked you all in advance to send through questions in advance. We've had a really strong response. What we've had to do, therefore, is we are now grouping those pre-questions. We've grouped them into what are basically frequently asked questions that we will be putting to our colleagues at the end of their presentation. But this does mean that because of the strong response we've had on pre-questions, we're going to prioritise those pre-questions. We will not be able to take live questions throughout the webinar at the end. We're going to prioritise the questions we have had in advance. With no further ado, just to tell you a little bit about the Foundation Years contract that we hold as NCB with the Department for Education. So we are DfE's stakeholder engagement partner. You can see our aims there. They are to improve practitioner knowledge and understanding. And of course, we hope to be doing this today by giving you this opportunity to hear directly from the Department for Education, the Standards Testing Agency, regarding baseline assessment. We also hope to improve the confidence of early years settings, and webinars are one of the ways we do that. So for example, a couple of months ago, we did our EYFSP reforms presentation via webinar with the Department for Education, and that's been downloaded in the region of 2,000 times by the early years workforce. We also want to facilitate a healthy debate between the DfE and the early years sector, and that's, you know, by providing opportunities like this, providing opportunity to question the policy, as you will have an opportunity to do today through those advanced questions. So the Foundation Years website has around 57,000 individual users per month. It's got a mailing list for the newsletter of about 27,000. We have these webinars throughout the year, and we also have the regional LED events, and I'll give you a bit more information about those towards the end of today's webinar. So with no further ado, we're going to move on now to hand over to, we have with us here today Harriet Rogerson from the Standards and Testing Agency, and Kathryn Dwyer, also from the Standards and Testing Agency, and Angela Hopkins from NFER. And I'm going to hand over to them as they talk about the reception baseline assessment, what you need to know. So over to you, Harriet and team.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ellie, and I hope that everyone can finally hear me properly. Please do write in the little chat box if not, and we'll try and make sure the technology is working as expected. So thank you all for joining us to discuss the reception baseline assessment. We hope that this will be an informative session, and we will be making sure to share as much information on the assessment as possible to ensure that the sector is well informed ahead of its statutory introduction this autumn. So just before we begin, I'd really like to thank NCB for putting on this webinar. I'm really grateful for the time that was taken to organise this, I'm really happy to join you today with Kathryn and Angela. And I'm also really glad we've got a good number of people joining us for this webinar. It's a really great opportunity for us to share information and hear some of your thoughts. And I hope that it'll provide the listeners, well, we've received a good amount of questions. So ask some really interesting questions and provide any comments as well. So any further questions that anyone does have that we've obviously not got time to answer today, we will receive those. So we'll do our best to answer them at a later date. So the introduction of the reception baseline assessment, which I will be referring throughout this webinar as the RBA, is something that has been through several stages of development. But throughout that whole process, the one thing that we've really been keen to do is to involve practitioners and parents and other key stakeholders to ensure that the assessment has been developed with users in mind. The pilot phase of the assessment has been a key element of this process, and while the pilot is still ongoing with pupils due to start reception throughout the academic year, we have gained enough evidence to show that the assessment is valid and fit for purpose, and it will therefore become a statutory assessment compulsory for all state-funded schools from autumn 2020, which is something we announced on the 26th of February, so just a few weeks ago when we published the RBA validity report on the pilot. But what we do want to do, and what we're using things like this webinar to do, is to continue the dialogue with the sector, ensuring that we're being as transparent as possible and obviously allowing you to raise any questions that you still have before the assessment does become statutory this autumn. So with the RBA, ministers and here at the department are really passionate to ensure that each and every child is given the opportunity to achieve their best, no matter their background or prior attainment. And so the purpose of the baseline is to measure the progress a school makes with their pupils. Of course, that is already done with Key Stage 1 teacher assessment, which is commonly known as SATs. And the introduction of the RBA does reflect a change in how the progress measure will work. So the purpose of this webinar is to hopefully provide as much information as possible about why we're moving the start of the progress measure to reception and what this will look like in practice for schools across England. So before we go into more detail, here's just a little bit about us. So with me here speaking today, I have Angela from the National Foundation for Educational Research, who we are working with on developing and delivering the RBA.
Hi everyone, my name is Angela and I work for NFER and I've been working on developing the RBA for the past few years.
And I also have Kathryn.
Hi, my name is Kathryn and I work for the Standards and Testing Agency here at the Department for Education, and I manage the contract we have with NFER on the RBA.
Thank you both. My name's Harriet. I work alongside Kathryn at the Standards and Testing Agency, mainly focusing on the policy and communications for the RBA. So just to provide a little bit more information about what we will cover today, first of all, we're going to discuss the background of the policy and talk a little bit more about its purpose. And then we're going to discuss in more detail about the pilot of the assessment and the pilot outcomes. And finally, then we will provide some more information on what comes next and what schools could do to get ready for the assessment before it comes statutory in autumn.
Thanks, Harriet. So yeah, to start with a little bit of background and history on the RBA. So for those who aren't aware, the RBA is a short teacher-mediated check of a child's early literacy, communication, language and mathematics skills. So the assessment will be administered in the first 6 weeks of a child's first reception and will form a starting point for a reception to Year 6 progress measure. So there will be no pass mark and schools and teachers will not be provided with children's scores, and this is to prevent any tracking or grouping of children. So first things first, we thought it would be beneficial to provide an overview of the history of the RBA and the reasons behind its introduction. So there's quite a long history to the reception baseline assessment, and a long process of assessment development has taken place in order to get us to where we are now. And as Harriet said, a large part of this process is engaging with stakeholders, from parents to unions to practitioners. So where this all started is in 2017, we had a 12-week consultation on primary assessment. So the purpose of this consultation was to ask for opinions on how best to reform the primary assessment system to create a reliable and trusted system in which progress can be measured fairly and accurately. So the consultation asked, among other things, the sector's view on the starting point for the progress measure. So as Harriet said, this currently sits at the end of Key Stage 1, with the progress measure currently assessing schools on the progress their children make between Year 2 and Year 6. The consultation showed that the majority of respondents were in favour of moving the starting point, so the baseline, from the end of Key Stage 1 to the start of reception. And so it was based on this that the government decided to trial the reception baseline assessment. So just to summarise the timeline of the assessment since that consultation, in April 2018, NFER were announced as the preferred supplier to develop and deliver the RBA for the first few years of its statutory delivery. So we announced our intention to have a small-scale trial followed by a large-scale pilot, with the intention to move to statutory delivery from autumn 2020, subject to the evidence from the trial and from the pilot. So in September and October 2018, we conducted a small-scale trial with 313 schools. This provided a nationally representative sample data to consider. And then starting in this academic year, 2019-20, we conducted a large-scale voluntary pilot, which will be the focus of our discussions shortly. So following the success of this pilot, from the academic year 2020-21 onwards, the assessment will move to a statutory delivery phase. So to set out a little bit about the aims of the RBA then, so in the consultation response, the government set out what would be done in order to ensure that the introduction of the baseline was high quality, appropriate for the age taking it, and minimising the burden on practitioners as much as possible. So one of the most important things for us while developing the assessment has been to make sure that the assessment is age appropriate. So the assessment has been developed so that children will be doing activities that they are very likely to be used to doing. The format of the assessment cannot be compared with the tests taken in formal conditions in Year 6 and later. So teachers should find the RBA similar to other on-entry assessments taken by the majority of schools at the start of reception. And we have also received positive feedback on the one-to-one time teachers are able to have with pupils when they first start school by doing the RBA. So the RBA will also give teachers and schools credit for the important work that they do in the first 3 years of a child's time at school. So at the moment, the often significant progress that children make from the moment they join school until the end of Key Stage 1 is not measured on a national level. So it's important that this work is going to be accounted for in progress calculations. It's also important to mention that there is no pass mark for the assessment. We have been very clear through the whole process of developing the assessment that data will not be shared with schools and is only going to be used to act as a starting point to calculate the cohort level progress measure at the end of Key Stage 2. So there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, we want to be clear that the assessment will not be used to hold early years settings to account. Secondly, we are working with the early years team, who are also making some important changes to the EYFS to try and prevent the tracking and grouping of individual children. So the progress measure will not be used to look at individual children's progress, but will look at the progress the school has made with a whole cohort across the 7 years. So schools should not use the assessment to set targets or make judgments about how a pupil might perform in the future. It's just a measure of where the child is now. Given the varied experiences of pupils before they start school, schools should not use this assessment and should not use any assessment to limit expectations. However, it's essential to know a pupil's actual starting point in order to measure progress fairly.
Thanks, Kathryn. So progress measures are a type of value-added measure, which means that pupils' results at the end of Key Stage 2 are compared to the actual achievements of other pupils nationally with a similar starting point or prior attainment. Currently, Key Stage 1 is used as the starting point for the calculation of the progress measures, and the RBA will provide a new starting point for the calculation of progress measures, which will first be published in summer 2027. So that's when pupils who did reception in 2020 will reach the end of Key Stage 2. Progress scores are calculated for individual pupils for the sole purpose of constructing a school's progress score. So we will not be publishing individual pupils' progress scores. We will only publish the school's progress scores. And just to give a little bit more information about how that calculation works at the minute, which the RBA calculation should be very similar to, is that we take the individual pupils' Key Stage 2 result. So, for example, in reading, we will then compare this to the national average Key Stage 2 attainment for pupils with a similar Key Stage 1 average point scores to them. A pupil's progress score is then the difference between their actual Key Stage 2 result and the average result of those in their prior attainment group. So if Kathryn, for example, received 102 in reading at Key Stage 2, and the average Key Stage 2 reading score for her prior attainment group was 101, her progress score would be +1. And then our final step is to create a school level progress score, which we do by adding together the progress scores of all the pupils in Year 6 and dividing by the number of Year 6 pupils in that school. So progress measures encourage schools to focus on lower retaining pupils as much as high retaining pupils, and it rewards schools with challenging circumstances without setting different expectations for pupils with different characteristics. It basically recognises the value that is added by schools. Attainment only, on the other hand, captures the ability of the child rather than the teaching. And this type of progress measure rewards schools for making progress with all of their pupils, whether they are low, middle, or high attainers. Any increase in attainment achieved by each pupil will be reflected in the school's progress scores. They are fairer to schools in challenging circumstances, and as they recognise a school that is doing a good job with an intake with poor prior attainment. In the past, some have raised concerns about the validity of the RBA, in that it will take a further 7 years, which is when the first cohort to do the RBA reaches Year 6, before we are able to statistically evaluate the relationship between baseline scores and Key Stage 2 scores. While this is true, the evidence that we have collected and research that we have used and conducted ourselves provides evidence that suggests that the RBA will provide an accurate picture of the early LCL and numeracy starting point of a school's intake, and that it is possible to use this data as a baseline for children's progress in LCL and mathematics. It is important that there is a statistically meaningful relationship between the baseline data and Key Stage 2 outcomes, as this enables progress to be measured effectively and allows for comparison of the progress of schools with similar starting points. Although there are a large number of factors that influence the progress children make between ages 4 and 11 and their attainment at the end of the key stage, research evidence suggests that the early language, communication and literacy and mathematics skills assessed by the RBA can be used as a reliable baseline for a progress measure of Key Stage 2 outcomes. The development of the tasks for the RBA were underpinned by research showing that LCL and mathematics skills are strongly related to later attainment. So we believe that there will be 2 important advantages of the RBA for schools. First, the need for statutory Key Stage 1 tests will be removed. And second, the progress measure will enable the contribution made by schools towards children's learning and development throughout the whole of their primary education to be recognised.
Thanks, Harriet. So, as mentioned, the assessment gives practitioners some important one-on-one time with children when they first start school. So just to give you a quick overview into how the assessment works in practice, what happens is that schools upload the pupil data to the online system. So we've tried to make this as easy as possible for schools so they can use the information in their school management information system and just upload it that way. Practitioners can then assess each pupil at any time within the first 6 weeks of that pupil starting reception, and they can easily see on the system which pupils have started, finished, or are yet to start the assessment. The digital system has been developed with the input of user research and is easy to navigate. In the user feedback survey from the pilot, 93% of practitioners agreed that they felt confident using the system. And based on some of the suggestions we received during the pilot, we are going to be making the system even easier to use. So we're making some small improvements based on the user feedback. So for example, we're making some small changes to make it easier to upload pupils to the system. Training materials are available to practitioners, including a detailed administration guide, videos on specific assessment items and resource management, a practice assessment, and system videos which explain how to use the digital system effectively. Again, most practitioners during the pilot found this training useful. 92% of them said that it was useful, and 88% said that an appropriate amount of information was provided in the admin guide and within the training videos. And most practitioners reported that the training in all took approximately 1 hour. So the assessment itself is loaded onto the system, so the practitioner simply has to log in. The assessment screen shows the script and the resource instructions question by question, so the practitioner knows exactly what to say and which resources to use for each question. Again, in the pilot survey, 86% of practitioners told us that it was easy to start the assessment. So the practitioner can easily go through the assessment with each child on their laptop or tablet and using the physical resources as necessary. They then click yes or no for each item, depending on how the child answered the question. The system then automatically routes the assessment, depending on how the child is doing, and this helps to prevent pupils from being presented with too many activities in which they are unlikely to be successful. The child doesn't interact with the screen, instead they use the physical resources provided during the assessment. So as mentioned, no score or numerical data is provided, but the practitioner can download a report for each child, and this gives them a series of narrative statements setting out the things they were able to do within each component, and this can help to inform teaching and learning.
So NFER was contracted as the supplier of the RBA in April 2018, and we have worked closely with them on the development of the assessment since. Angela from NFER will now give you some information on the assessment development process.
Thanks, Harriet. NFER has a wealth of experience in assessments, and it's of vital importance that a statutory national assessment, such as the RBA, is technically robust and appropriate for use by practitioners and for children starting reception. Our approach to the design and development of this assessment is underpinned by our in-depth knowledge built up over more than 70 years and our experience in developing other baseline schemes for young children with input from practitioners. The assessment has undergone a thorough development and a review process lasting several years. To give you a quick overview, this has included development of assessment content by early years and assessment development experts, which has drawn on NFER's previous baseline assessment, known as RBA 15. Cultural review of the assessment, as well as reviews by experts in early years education and special educational needs and disabilities. Regular advice from expert and practitioner panels. A trial of the assessment content and online system with more than 3,000 pupils in September 2018. A pilot of the assessment this academic year with more than 9,000 schools, observations of the assessments and user research of the system throughout the trialling and pilot periods, and rigorous statistical analyses of the trialling and pilot data. When the RBA was originally announced, the aim was for the assessment to measure early maths and LCL skills. Using NFER's existing baseline assessment, the RBA 15, as a starting point for the new RBA, NFER identified changes needed, including additional items to meet the DFE specification for the new reception baseline assessment. In developing the supplementary items for maths and LCL, we took account of advice and steers from a practitioner panel and an expert advisory panel, as well as the DFE's own early years team. Moving on to these review panels, for all the components of the assessment development processes have been aligned with those for other national curriculum assessments. So this means that there have been numerous expert review panels at each stage of the development. In the case of RBA, all these panels had an important input into the assessment to ensure that it's fit for purpose and that it is accessible for the majority of reception age children. Looking at accessibility in particular, the feedback we have had from experts indicates that they are happy that the RBA is as accessible as possible. For example, the SEND reviewer commented that the assessment shows an excellent regard for the barriers that SEND children may face. And the appropriacy of the assessment materials was also remarked on, as the reviewer considered that the majority of SEND pupils should be able to access the assessment. It was felt that the guidance documentation sets high expectations for pupils with SEND. The cultural reviewer considered that all the materials were acceptable from a cultural point of view and are unproblematic across a wide spectrum of religious and ethnic communities. The inclusive nature of the images was also remarked upon, since they include variations of skin tone without exaggerating physical differences. Modified materials have also been developed and are available for children with visual and/or hearing impairments. In addition, practitioners can make other necessary changes. For example, they can change the font colour if they deem this to be needed. These are available to schools on request, but we do not anticipate that many schools will need these. So moving on to the trial, the first time the assessment was seen by schools was in autumn 2018, when there was a small-scale trial. 313 nationally representative schools trialled the assessment, and more tasks were trialled than would have been in the final assessment, so that we could see which ones performed best. For reference, the final RBA contains about half of the items that were trialled. The trial revealed that the nature of the assessment, and that is a set of tasks delivered one-to-one with a pupil, where the total time for the whole assessment is 20 minutes, provided some limitations on what could be assessed. Aside from this, there was, though, generally very good feedback from the trial. Very large numbers of practitioners rated the suitability of the practical resources as satisfactory or above. And by subject, that was 95% for maths and 93% for LCL. Specific comments about the tasks received in feedback from the trial were considered during the item selection process, helping to ensure that only those items considered most appropriate were included. The trial was very useful in pointing to areas of improvement ahead of the larger scale pilot in autumn 2019. And the analysis of the data and practitioner feedback meant that changes were made to the guidance, to the digital system, and to the assessment itself ahead of the pilot. The assessment materials were also reviewed again with panels of stakeholders, experts and practitioners following the trial. And the trial also gave us important information to be able to finalise the routing of the assessment. Moving on to the pilot, all eligible schools with a reception cohort were invited to take part in a national voluntary pilot of the RBA in the academic year 2019 to 20. Lots of schools across the country have taken the opportunity to have an input in the development of this assessment, with over 9,000 signing up to take part. Just to clarify what eligible means, all maintained infant, first and primary schools across England, including special schools and service children education schools, were invited to participate in the pilot phase of the RBA. Independent schools and pupil referral units were excluded. The assessment that went to pilot was finalised based on the years of research, development and stakeholder feedback. It covers mathematics and LCL, which can be broken down as follows. For the mathematics tasks, it covers early number, early calculation, and that covers early addition and subtraction, mathematical language, and early understanding of pattern. And for LCL, it covers early vocabulary, phonological awareness, and early comprehension. The aim of the pilot was to check that the assessment approach and the systems and guidance are fit for purpose, and also that the outcomes of the assessment meet all the key requirements. This includes ensuring that the assessment is reliable and that it's appropriate for use in the first 6 weeks of reception. The majority of pupils start reception in September, and so most assessments were completed in the first half term of the current academic year. However, the pilot continues throughout this year, as some schools do have children starting reception at different points. For example, some will have started after Christmas and some after Easter. However, this will be small scale. The pilot gave us a significant amount of feedback. In September to October 2019, 7,046 schools completed the RBA with all their pupils. This gave us a good amount of data to analyse. Practitioners were invited to complete surveys to give feedback on the assessment, the system, and on the training to enable us to make any final amendments and clarifications to ensure the baseline is as user-friendly as possible. Following the pilot, SDA made this decision to remove one LCL task and one mathematics task from the assessment. The LCL task related to early reading, which very few pupils completed due to routing, and even fewer pupils answered correctly. The assessment has been developed to be suitable for the full range of attainment that can be seen with this age group, so that more challenging tasks are included, and it is not the expectation that all children will be able to successfully answer all questions. However, there were not sufficient numbers of pupils answering the reading question successfully to merit the inclusion of an additional item in the assessment. The mathematics task related to shape. Although this task functioned appropriately and was answered correctly by many pupils, it was removed to balance the assessment between the two components. Moving to Harriet.
Oh, thank you. So, as Angela mentioned, during the first half of the autumn term, assessment data was gathered for over 339,000 pupils. So in order to consider the success of the pilot, we have gathered evidence from practitioner surveys on the assessment, the online system and the training. Along with this, qualitative evidence has also been gathered through quality monitoring visits from NFER and also multiple practitioner panels. Evidence gained has demonstrated that the pilot was a success, with largely positive feedback from schools and practitioners. So some key figures are 84% of practitioners rated that children's interest and enjoyment of the tasks was at least satisfactory, and an even higher proportion, 89%, said that children's understanding of the tasks was satisfactory or better. 0.8% of pupils scored no marks, and less than 0.4% achieved full marks. This provides evidence that there is not what we call a ceiling effect on the assessment, and that it can easily discriminate well between pupils across the ability range. So as you can see from the slide on the screen now, the majority of practitioners indicated that it was clear when to award yes or no to a child, and the feedback indicated that 91% of practitioners felt confident carrying out the assessment. The data from the pilot shows that on average, the assessment will take just over 14 minutes to complete, with 92% of administrations being completed within 20 minutes. In terms of the assessment working as expected, the pilot gave us some good feedback on the reliability of the assessment. So validity is a central concept in assessment theory and is designed by Ofqual as the degree to which it is possible to measure what that assessment ought to measure by implementing its assessment arrangements. Something used to measure validity in assessment is called internal reliability, which basically means that an assessment is measuring what you want it to measure in a consistent way. The internal reliability of the assessment was measured using something called Cronbach's alpha, which showed that the assessment demonstrates a high degree of internal consistency reliability. So overall, the assessment that we gathered from the pilot demonstrates that the assessment works as expected.
Thanks, Harriet. So what happens next? So there is some work for us at the DfE to be doing. That includes taking on all the feedback from the pilot. So we will be making some small changes to the guidance materials, including clarifying instructions on resource management and adding in some case studies. Also, the script will be tweaked to show where children can be prompted and to just clarify some things where some practitioners have let us know that it was difficult to determine whether the pupil was wrong or right. And while feedback on the digital system was overall positive, we do plan to make some small improvements to the online system just to make sure it's as easy to use as possible and that the guidance is clear and effective. On a practical note, schools that must take part in the RBA will have now been sent a survey asking them to confirm their details so that they receive the correct number of resources in advance of the autumn term. So they've got until the 3rd of April to complete this, and otherwise census data information will be used. And so we are encouraging all schools that receive this survey to complete it as soon as they can. So when we have all the relevant information, resources for the assessment will be sent out towards the end of the summer term, and practitioners will be able to access the system, so the practice assessment and the training materials before the summer holidays. And finally, the assessment will be statutory from autumn 2020. So this means that all maintained schools with the reception cohort will be expected to administer the assessment in the first 6 weeks in which a child starts reception.
So that's everything from us. If we turn back to Ellie, we'll be able to answer some of the questions that were sent in before the webinar started.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, team. Thank you, Kathryn, Harriet and Angela. That was very thorough. And really good to hear as well that there's going to be some case studies and some resources sent out to support. That sounds really positive. Okay. What we're going to do now is, I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, but just in case there was anybody who's just logged in who didn't catch it, but we had really strong response to our request for pre-questions. What we've decided to do is to group those. They had themes, so we've kind of grouped them into themes. So you may not hear your actual pre-question read out, but I hope you will hear the one that is relevant to the theme that you sent in. So we're going to put those questions to the team now. We have had an awful lot of questions coming in as Harriet and team have been speaking, and so we are noting all of those, and the plan is that they will go to SDA and NFER after this webinar today, and we will be asking them to respond to those questions, and we'll be posting those responses onto the Foundation News website. So you're ready for questions then, guys?
Yeah, ready.
Okay, so the first question is regarding feedback on the pilot. So it's how did DFE receive feedback on the pilot, and how has this been used?
Okay, yes, so we received a lot of different feedback throughout the whole process, so not just from the pilot but also from the trials. And this feedback, it's been various different ways and it's been used for lots of different purposes. So some of the feedback that we have gathered has been through analysing the data from when schools have been doing the assessment. So the trial, for example, provided data about each question and how well it functioned. And this was with as we said, with a nationally representative sample of pupils. So this allowed us to look at how the assessment was working and tweak the assessment based on that, and allowed us to improve the content of the assessment. And we also have gathered a wide range of qualitative feedback on a number of elements of the assessment. So during the pilot in particular, schools were invited to complete 3 surveys. One was on the training materials, one was on the assessment itself, and one was on the online system. So this gave us some kind of important statistics on how the pilot was received, but also there was feedback from observation visits, user research visits, and from quality monitoring visits. Also, as we mentioned in the main presentation, there were panels which were consulted at each stage of the assessment development process. So, for example, the practitioner panel met shortly after Christmas, and they'd all participated in the pilot, so they were able to give some more in-depth feedback, which wasn't possible to get from everybody, but was very useful as part of the process. So all of this type of feedback was very important and helped us to make decisions on how to improve the guidance, improve the system, and make tweaks to the assessment itself.
Right, and that's from those 9,000 schools, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question, the theme of the question has been around the type of assessment. So it's basically asking why the RBA is not an observational assessment like other baseline assessments, which are more commonly used within early years and more readily available to practitioners in the early years.
Okay. The purpose of the RBA is to provide a snapshot of a child's early language, communication and literacy and their math skills when they begin school. It's been developed, the baseline assessment has been developed to generate reliable data that will meet the stated purpose of this assessment. Ongoing assessment of pupils in reception will be captured through the EYFSP, which is observational. I think it's important to say that whilst teachers' professional judgment is obviously an invaluable tool for teaching and learning, in order to make an accurate and consistent assessment of children's ability, which can be compared between schools on a national scale, it is necessary to standardise the delivery and data collection. Hence, the design is the way it is.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Angela. There's been some concerns from teachers about the ability to come out of class to deliver this assessment and how that impacts on the school day. So how can teachers manage the reception baseline assessment while also managing the rest of a class? As I think that's the expectation.
Yeah, so I think one of the main things that we have been conscious of throughout the development process of the RBA is making it as flexible as possible for schools. So the RBA can be administered by a variety of practitioners, so it doesn't have to be the reception teacher. It could be the reception teaching assistant or another suitably qualified practitioner, such as an early years lead or a special educational needs coordinator. As long as they're familiar to the child, then they can administer the assessment. So schools can manage this depending on how their own setting works. Also, we've talked about timing quite a bit, so the assessment should take 15 to 20 minutes to complete per child. There's also a pause function in the system, so the assessment can be paused at any time, and it's generally recommended that the two components, so the maths and the LCL, should be split over 2 sessions with a break in between, ideally on separate days. So it's up to the practitioner how this is managed, but this flexibility is designed to help the assessment to fit in around normal classroom practice, so that they can work around it. Okay, so you'd be potentially looking at splitting the 15 to 20 minutes into 2 anyway. Yeah. Is that right? Right. Okay. Okay. So of course, the baseline assessment is becoming compulsory in September 2020. So there's been lots of questions about how this impacts on the EYFSP. So the question is, will practitioners still be expected, would schools still be expected to submit data on the EYFSP in summer 2021?
Yes. So the RBA and the EYFSP, the Early Years Foundation Stage Profile, they have very different purposes. So while the RBA is a snapshot of children's LCL math skills at the very start of reception, and to establish a progress measure, the EYFSP it provides information to teachers and parents on an individual child development, obviously by the end of the Early Years Foundation stage and looking at their readiness for year 1. So it's taken at the end of reception and it's observational throughout the year. So that will still remain a statutory assessment taken at the end of the reception year, and schools must still follow the guidelines provided for submitting EYFSP data.
Yeah. So yes, so still EYFSP summer 2021, and of course the big difference is the EYFSP is about the individual child, which does have some link to the next question, which you have covered in your presentation, but I think good to touch base on and clarify again. So one of the questions that we've had in advance was, I would like to clarify whether reception teachers will see the results of the reception baseline assessment.
So yeah, we have mentioned this in the main presentation, but no numerical data will be published or shared with schools or parents. However, teachers will receive a series of short narrative statements after completing the assessments, which will inform them how a child did at each time. And this is because that we've always been clear that the assessment shouldn't be used to judge or label individual children. And we will only use the data at the end of Key Stage 2 to create the baseline for the school level progress measures. However, the RBA can be used to complement other baselines that many schools already complete with their children when they first start reception. And one thing is we have received positive feedback from the pilot, with practitioners telling us that the information gathered from the assessment, from both one-to-one time and from the narrative statements themselves, has meant that they haven't had to complete the other additional literacy and numeracy baselines that they might have completed in those first few weeks of reception or first few months of reception anyway. So just in practical terms, the narrative statements will be able to download shortly after term begins, and these can obviously be shared with parents at parents' evenings if a school does wish to do so as well.
Okay, yeah, so they can be shared with parents, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, we've had a lot of questions and possibly anxiety, I think, really, around SEND and the use of the assessment. So this question brings all of those together succinctly. So will pupils with SEND be able to access the assessment, and are there going to be modifications that are put in place for pupils with SEND?
Okay. As we mentioned a number of times in the presentation, yes, the assessment has been designed so that the majority of children will be able to access the assessment. As part of the development process and separate to the practitioner and expert panels, the materials were reviewed by both a cultural reviewer and an SEND reviewer to ensure they were suitable for use. We have also designed modified materials that can be ordered for children with visual impairments. And practitioners can also make further modifications to the assessment materials if they feel it's necessary to do that. This can include copying printed resources onto larger paper or coloured paper. And the assessment can also be taken in British Sign Language, although it is important that assessment materials do remain confidential if further modifications are made. There is no time limit for the assessments, so children can take as long as they need to answer questions, and there is no need to apply for any sort of access arrangements. Modifications can be made based on the normal classroom practice used for the child. There will be some rare circumstances in which a child cannot access any part of the assessment, and in this case we do say it is down to the head teacher to decide if a child should be disapplied. If a head teacher does decide to disapply a child, they should have had discussions with the child's parents first and should make sure to tell parents about their final decision.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So a key thing that you said there is that there isn't a time limit, so if it needs to take longer for a child with SEND, it can do. Yeah,
Carl, so there's no need to apply for any sort of extra time or anything like that. There's no time at all, yeah.
Okay. This is a question about being trained to undertake the assessment, really. So one teacher was concerned whether there would be any training provided, as in provided to undertake the assessment. And do you have any estimation of how long that training would take?
Okay, so yeah, all the training for the assessment is on the online system, and so everybody who is planning on administering the assessment should ensure that they're familiar with this and with the admin guide before they assess any children. So there are multiple training videos, some are about how to use the online system, but in terms of the assessment itself, there are several videos which go through how exactly to administer certain questions. And also the training and the system gives practitioners the option to go through a practice assessment, and we had a lot of positive feedback on this during the pilot, so we definitely would recommend that everybody uses that. It can be really helpful. It can help practitioners to judge which materials might need modifying for individual children, and it can just help them to use the materials in practice to see, for example, if where they're planning on doing the assessment will work. So in terms of the training, it's the responsibility of head teachers to ensure that sufficient training time has been given to those who will be administering the assessment and using the system. And some practitioners, when giving feedback about the assessment, said that they found it useful to use part of their inset day in September to go through the training. Because schools, I think as we mentioned, will be able to access these materials from the end of the summer term, so they'll be able to watch the videos, practice the assessment over summer holidays if they need to. And in terms of the time that the training takes, the feedback is that it should take about 1 hour in total. And yeah, just to say from the pilot, I think as we mentioned, we've received very positive feedback on the training. So yeah, we hope it's going to be useful.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Okay, Harriet, Kathryn and Angela, this is an area that I think the workforce are quite concerned about, and that is around how the assessment, in your opinion, impacts on the children themselves. So could, for example, doing the assessment, especially in the first 6 weeks of school, be stressful for the child? And linked to that, could it also lead to results that aren't reliable?
Yeah, so this is something that we obviously know is a concern among the sector, but what we do also know is that feedback from the pilot has shown that children weren't always aware that they were being assessed, and that the baseline has been designed to reflect the type of assessments that many schools already carry out in reception, so that tasks are likely to be activities that children are used to and have experienced before. Obviously, the assessment is carried out one-to-one with a practitioner, so someone that that children are familiar with. And children are assessed. It's simple, practical tasks that might include counting or describing pictures. It's been designed to reflect the type of activities that many parents already do with their children at home. And there's absolutely no need for teachers or parents to prepare children for the assessment at all. So there's no expectation, there's no pass mark. It's a snapshot of where children are when they first start reception. Practitioners will see in the guidance provided that they are able to praise children throughout the assessment, so saying well done after every question. And of course, the assessment isn't done in any formal conditions. As we've mentioned a few times, it can be paused as and when child needs a break, which does make the assessment comfortable and age appropriate for the child taking it. As for the reliability question, so throughout the whole process of developing the assessment, work has been done to make sure that the assessment is valid and fit for purpose, and hopefully some of the content of the main presentation shared some of that information that we published in the validity report a few weeks ago, so that has a lot of information about this. But yeah, all the evidence has in that report, and what we've hopefully said today has been gathered to show that the assessment is reliable for that purpose of creating a progress measure in schools. Okay, yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, and I mean, I think that's what will be at the forefront of the majority of practitioners' minds, is around the impact on the child. So thank you for answering that. Okay, so they were actually our themed pre-questions. So that's the end of our question section. So I would just like to say a big thank you to yourselves, Harriet, Angela, Kathryn, for your time today. We started slightly later than we expected.
what is it about IT? Always something comes up that you don't expect, but we did get there in the end. I'm sure the audience have been really pleased. Just to reiterate to the audience, yes, there have been an awful lot of questions also coming through while you've been speaking. So possibly people are feeling that not all of those pre-questions that we themed there covered their questions. So we have noted every one of those questions. I have people in the room with me who've been noting every one of those questions, and they're going to be going over to the team after the webinar is live today. We will get those posted on the Foundation Years website as soon as we can. So thank you very much, Kathryn, Angela and Harriet from STA and NFER. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
a lot.
Ellie.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye. Okay, so just to end the webinar today, I hope you have found that informative. I hope you found that useful. Just to tell you a few more things, we do have further webinars planned. In April, we will have one with Dr. Julian Grenier about the work he's been doing on updating development matters. And if you're interested in that, then very shortly it will be advertised through the Foundation newsletters and news flashes. We also expect, we've just finished actually in January a really successful round of LED events regionally across the country with the Department for Education, and we do expect to be delivering more of those in summer of this year. So again, that would be advertised through the Foundation Years website. We have, if you haven't actually been to the Foundation Years website recently, we have made that refreshed and more accessible. So do go along and have a look. And I'm sure all of our listeners will be signed up to the newsletters, but do share the word. It's a brilliant way of getting up-to-date research and policy direct into your inbox. So we would just like to thank our audience today for listening in, for your questions, especially those who gave us pre-questions in advance, and to reassure those that have got further questions and have sent them through, they are going to be passed on to the team now. Do watch this space for further details of upcoming webinars and events, and our contact email is there if you want to get in touch with us with any questions or comments. So once again, I hope you all have a great evening, and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.